Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Path to DevOps series. If you're not up to date with what's happening right now, let me recap that for you in just a bit. So we're now trying to deploy our stack of microservices to Azure Kubernetes Services, and in doing so, we actually found 3 work items we're planning to implement. The first one was implemented in the previous episode, and it was a set of manifests to deploy to Kubernetes, which are actual templates that we can parameterize inside of a deployment pipeline. So today, the next logical step would be to create the pipeline. Now, if this sounds fun, let's start doing it. Before jumping into the real hard work of creating a deployment pipeline, let's see where we're at the moment. So we do have one pipeline so far for each of the 3 microservices in the Barbart stack, which is actually the stack of microservices we're working with in this Path to DevOps journey. And basically what this build pipeline does is, in a code repo where we have our either Java or our Angular code, we run a pipeline from there, and basically we use Docker to compile the application. Then we build an image based on that compiled application, on that artifact. And then we tag and push that image into Docker Hub. So this is basically a simple build pipeline, okay? We just compile the application. Obviously, there should have been some unit testing going on in there, but I'm not a developer and I'm certainly not a tester, so I'm not that proficient with code, which is why I didn't try to spend a lot of time on that. Let's just imagine there's unit testing in there and everything is passing, yeah? But basically, we're compiling the application, we're unit testing it, and then we take the resulting artifact and we put that in a Docker image. That's our exchange coin we're going to work with from now on. So we're working with Docker images. That's our actual artifact. And we push that artifact into Docker Hub. Now, having the artifact in Docker Hub doesn't help us a lot. It's not actually deployed anywhere. We can't use it. It's not a running functional application, which is why right now we're trying to deploy this to Kubernetes, and we need to create an additional pipeline, a deploy pipeline. And I know some of you will look at this and say, well, that's not actually how DevOps should be done. And I might agree with you, but what I'm trying to do here is to take you through a journey. So there's no way you will learn and you will understand what problems DevOps is trying to solve if you don't make mistakes on your way there. Yeah. So if you don't make any sort of mistakes, if I just hand the solution over to you, you're not going to comprehend it. And I'm certain of that because I've been where you are now a few years before. Yeah. So what I'm trying to do here is to take you through the logical incremental steps of what you're doing. Yeah, the first part of the Path to DevOps journey was to start your application locally, and that's perfect for anyone that's new to software development and to DevOps because you actually understand what you're doing. You understand your software. You understand how the applications integrate with one another, how the front end tries to communicate with the back ends. Yeah, once you have that, we can go even more advanced, and we brought in cloud and pipelines and Kubernetes, and I actually have a whole series on Kubernetes and containers on this channel, so check that out if you feel like it and if this is an interesting topic for you. But all in all, we're now trying to put everything together and glue it all up and deploy. So because we already have the build pipeline, we're trying to create a deploy pipeline, and the deploy pipeline will look like this. Yeah, we also have the code repository where we store the source code of the microservice, and from there we actually trigger the pipeline. Yeah, it's going to be a new pipeline, the deploy pipeline, but this pipeline will also need the YAML manifest, which is the template we will use to deploy to Kubernetes. And that template, we will store it in a different repository, yeah, because this is something common for our 3 applications. There's no way we need to actually duplicate it and store it in each code repository, because if we did that and we had to make a change to the YAML manifest, we had to make actually 3 changes, 1 in each repository. So we don't want that. We want a central manifest to deploy with, and we're going to store it in a repository that I, for convenience, called tools. Yeah, so we will create the tools repository and store the manifest in there. And then we have this set of logical steps where we configure that manifest. If you followed along with the previous episode, we're actually replacing those tokens in the YAML manifest and giving it proper values that it can use to deploy to the Kubernetes API. And obviously then we will send that request to the AKS API. And then the AKS will handle pulling the image from Docker Hub if our repository is public. Yeah. So this is on the agenda for today, and actually not everything. We're not going to create the AKS cluster. I'm going to do this in a future episode because I forecast there will be a lot of content only for today for creating the pipeline. So today we're just focusing on this part here, and I actually have an agenda for today. Yeah, as you can see here on today's menu, we have 3 major steps. The first one is to create the tools repo and to populate it with the necessary stuff, the necessary goodies that we need in the pipeline. Then the second step will be to create the actual deployment pipeline, and I'll show you how to do that in just a few moments. And then we will need to create some variable groups because I designed this deployment pipeline to be extremely easy to set up by you guys. So all you need to do is to follow along with this, and in the end you will have a fully functional pipeline, I promise, that is able to deploy to an AKS cluster. The only disclaimer here is that you need to have an Azure subscription and to create an AKS cluster in there, but we're going to do that in a future video. Yeah. So without further ado, let's get our hands dirty. Okay, so the first thing on today's menu was the fact that we needed to create the necessary stuff for the pipeline to work, which is basically the tools repository, and to populate it with the necessary files. So I got you guys. Everything is on my GitHub account in the path to DevOps _Azure _DevOps repo. So if you open this, these are basically the 2 files. Yeah, so we have the 2 pipeline files, the one for build and deploy. These are not necessary to exist in the tools file. These will sit in the code repo. And the first 2 files actually are the Kubernetes manifest, which is tokenized. And I actually made a change to it since last episode, so make sure to take the latest version. Yeah, even if you previously downloaded it, just re-download it once more. And there's also the set token values.ps1, which is a PowerShell script that replaces the tokens in the manifest. Yeah, and the pipeline will need these 2 in order to function properly. Okay, so what you need to do is to go in Azure DevOps in your organization, open your project, hit repos, and from here I already have my tools repo created. But what you need to do is create a new repository, clone it locally. It's going to be empty. Yeah, you're going to use the git clone command. And then in that folder that gets created, you put the 2 files that you downloaded from here, okay, with the same names. So it will look something like this in the end. Yeah, you have a repo called tools, and then there will be this main branch, and you'll have the Kubernetes manifest.yml and the set token values.ps1, exactly as I showcased them on the GitHub account. Okay, once this is done, we can move on to the next step. The next step would be to create an Azure pipeline based on this pipeline deploy.yml definition. But the only thing that I want to do first is I want to explain the YAML to you guys so that you understand what's happening in here. And after that, we're going to add it into our code repository and create it. Yeah. So if you take a look at the YAML file, and we're going to go through it and explain, it's also commented, so you should get a better understanding of what's happening. In here, as a resource, we declare the tools repository. Yeah, this is the actual name of the repository, and this is an alias that we will be using throughout the pipeline. Okay, so capital is the actual name of the repo, as you can see here, and then lowercase is the alias. Yeah, and we're saying that it's of type Git, so it's actually sitting here in Azure DevOps. Then we need to declare 2 variable groups, and as I stated previously, we will need to create them in order for the pipeline to function properly, and I will show you how to do that in the future. But basically, you know how to create variable groups so far, so we're just going to create 2 more. Yeah, and they are referenced in here. Trigger none means that when you push the commit to that branch, it's not going to automatically trigger the pipeline, and I'm going to explain that in just one moment. We're going to use the Ubuntu latest pool, and then we have the steps keyword, yeah, which means these are all steps which will be executed in order for us to obtain the deployment to Kubernetes. Okay, so the first one is we're checking out the tools repository. Yeah, we need to have these two files. We need the Kubernetes manifest and we need the PowerShell script inside of the pipeline at runtime. Yeah, we need to use them and we need to download them. So the checkout step will do this for us. Okay, it checks out the tools repo. That's perfect. Now, once we have this, I have this step which is called read environment variables. It's a PowerShell step, and basically it's more for troubleshooting. It helps me understand what kind of environment variables exist in the pipeline, and if these variable groups had their variables ingested. Okay, this can help you troubleshoot. So when you declare variable groups at this level, you expect the variables inside of them to exist in the pipeline. So if in this step I don't see the variables from here, something went wrong. I might have misspelled the name, or I didn't add the variables in the group, but anyway, it helps me troubleshoot and understand better what's going on. Now, the next step is another PowerShell step called prepare deployment. So in here, we check that we have the files from the tools repo. As I said, we are checking them out. So in the working directory from the pipeline, we just do a get child item and we select the files that exist in that folder. And you will see in the output that the two files do exist. Then we compose some necessary variables, and you need to make sure here that you don't forget to replace this bracket. Yeah, so you have some stuff to replace. You cannot just copy paste this and expect it to work. You need to replace everything that's in caret brackets like this. Yeah, so the name of the microservices in our case will be either cart API or product API or front end. In here it's the same thing, cart API, product API or front end. Then we have an environment variable called image tag, and this is very important because what I'm expecting the pipeline to do, or the design of the pipeline, is it needs only one thing to run, and that thing is actually the image tag. So basically the pipeline will deploy to Kubernetes the version of the Docker image that I give it as input. So I need to give this variable as input, and I will show you how to do that in a few minutes. Once I've composed these necessary variables, what I will do here is I will print them so I can see that they have the right values. Also helpful for troubleshooting. And then the next step is we replace those tokens in the Kubernetes manifest. So everything in here will get populated with variables inside the pipeline. And this will become a human readable file and also a Kubernetes API readable file. Okay? And then we just get the content of the Kubernetes manifest in order to see if everything got populated correctly. I think it's the right thing to do for troubleshooting. And then the next step is to deploy to Azure Kubernetes Service. Now again, we're not creating the cluster today, so this will ultimately fail. But the caveat here is that once we create the Kubernetes cluster next time, we can actually run the pipeline and see if it works. Okay? So the only thing you need to replace here is the name of your Azure Resource Manager service connection. And this is basically a bridge between your Azure DevOps organization and your Azure subscription. You need to let the Azure DevOps organization somehow know in which subscription you want to deploy, and also it needs the permissions necessary to deploy in that subscription. So this is what the service connection will do for us. Okay? And then it's just plain code that you don't need to change. So this is made to work out of the box, this step here. So out of these three changes, out of one here, one here, one here, and declaring this variable, I'll show you how, everything should work out of the box. So if you encounter issues, write me a comment down below. Okay? So now let's get into actually creating the pipeline object and adding this into our code repository. To create the pipeline, we need to add the deployment manifest into the code repo, and I'm going to showcase how you can do this only for the cart API repo, and you just need to replicate the set of steps for product API and front end, and it's basically the same steps, so I'm not going to do it for all three. This is basically your homework to practice your craft. So in our case, we are in cart API repo, and in the master branch. Yeah. So I'm going to create a new branch actually. And it's gonna be called add deploy minus pipe. Yeah. And there we have it. And you can just use the UI here. You don't even need to go and do that from the IDE. And I'm going to create a new file. And we already have a pipeline.yml for the build pipeline. I should have anticipated and named this build pipeline, but I didn't. So I will just rename the new one. I will name the new one pipeline deploy.yml. Yeah. And now that I've created it, I can just go on GitHub and copy from this button here and just paste. And again, as I said, you need to make some changes. So the name of your microservices, in our case, is cart API. And I'm just going to put it lowercase. And you should too. Then we need the full image name here. So the full image name is basically your image name from the Docker Hub. We've done this in a previous video. So again, it's cart API lowercase. It should match if you followed along. Yeah, so cart API lowercase. And then you need the service connection. So let me show you how to create a service connection, even a dummy one. If you don't have an Azure subscription and you can't follow along, you can still make this work. So you go to project settings in a new tab, and in here on the service connections menu. Yeah, and I already have one which is called PC-team2. I'll do that. But for you guys, what you need to do is, I will add this for now. Go to new service connection and hit the Azure Resource Manager. And I'm just going to move my image so you can see the full menu. So Azure Resource Manager is the thing you're looking for. And what I've done it manually. You can do it automatically if you want, but you're going to skip the part of understanding what's happening. Yeah. So let's do the manual part. And basically what's happening here is Azure DevOps is asking for a service principal. Yeah, it's saying here in the name. And the service principal is basically an identity in Azure Active Directory. It's basically like a user. Instead of having a username and a password, you have an ID and a secret. It's basically the same thing. The naming differs, but what a service principal is, you can't log in with it. Yeah, you can't use it in a browser to log in, but you can use its identity to do stuff. So if you assign a role to that service principal, let's say contributor, on a certain resource level, let's say a resource group, you can use that service principal to deploy stuff into the resource group if you know its username and password. So what we're doing here is basically we're teaching Azure DevOps to interact with an Azure subscription. Yeah, so it's asking for a subscription ID and the name, and then, as I said, it asks for the service principal ID and key, and for your tenant ID, and then you just give it a name and you verify, and everything is fine. But again, this means you need to create a service principal beforehand, and you need to do this on your own. So if you don't know how to do this, you can just go the easy way out and select the resource manager automatic. And in this case, if you are using the same user for Azure DevOps as you have for your Azure subscription, and obviously if you have the permissions to create a service principal in your tenant, then it will do this for you automatically, and you just need to name it, and that's it. All right. As I said, I've done it manually. I've created my own service principal, and I've done this journey here. Yeah. Again, filling in all of these fields. You can find documentation online how to do this, or again, as I said, if it's easier for you, just go the automatic route, and only if that one fails, consider doing everything manually. And if you don't have the tenant level permissions to create a service principal, maybe talk to one of your admins on the tenant and ask them for a service principal that you can use, and then go the manual way and fill in the information. Okay. But once you've created this, so you don't even need to create a valid one, yeah, for the pipeline to work. All you need to do is go the manual way and just fill in some stuff here, put a GUID in here, a random name, random service principal ID, random key, tenant, and instead of hitting verify at the end or verify and save here at the bottom, you can just hit save, and it's not going to verify the service connection. Okay, so the pipeline, you will be able to run it, but when you hit this step of talking to the Azure subscription to deploy to Kubernetes, it will obviously fail. So if you want to just create a service connection and get your hands on it, you can do that. I recommend having an Azure subscription and following along, obviously. Now, if you don't afford that, just watch the video and try to get the most learning out of seeing me do it. Okay? So once this is done and you have your service connection and you've filled in your information here, this is it. Your YAML manifest is completed. So now you can create the pipeline object. Yeah, we already have the 3 build pipelines. So if you go to new pipeline, let me move myself back in the top corner, Azure repos git, because that's where we're keeping our code, cart API, existing YAML file. Unfortunately, it's not on the master branch, it's on the new branch that we created. And if you hit path, you will see pipeline deploy, continue, and here we have it, the majestic deploy pipeline in its natural habitat. Okay, so remember I talked about this variable here, image_tag. Well, all you need to do is go to variables, add a new variable, in the name field just paste it here, hit the let users override this variable, this value when running the pipeline. This is important. And as a value, just add the latest tag you have for your cart API image in Docker Hub. Okay, so in Docker Hub on repositories, you should see 3 of them. Just hit cart API, and the one that's with green here, the latest one, just copy it and paste it here and hit OK and save. Yeah. And now instead of run, just hit the caret here and save the pipeline, because, well, if you go to all pipelines, I've already created a folder called build where I stored the build pipelines, and I will create a new folder called deploy, and I will also store this. But again, when you run the pipeline, you might not be aware of the folder, so I don't like the name. Usually Azure DevOps by default inherits the name of the repo, and it's gonna cause confusion because you have a build pipeline with the cart API name and a deploy pipeline with the same name. So what I want to do here is rename this one to cart API -deploy and also move it in the deploy folder. And this should help me understand which pipeline has been running. Yeah. So last thing you need to do, if you go back to your YAML file, is to make sure these 2 variable groups exist. Okay, so you need to create them, and I'll take you through the journey of each one. I already have them created, but I'll just show you what they contain, and you can do it yourself. Yeah. So pipelines, library, and in here we have our variable groups. We already had our Docker credential variable group, so you should be accustomed to this menu. Now you will need to create a variable group for each microservice, and this one will contain the values necessary to populate the YAML manifest. Okay, so if we go back to the tools repository this time, and we open the Kubernetes manifest, you should notice that these tokens, yeah, they're supposed to be environment variables during the pipeline, and the PowerShell script will replace them. Okay, so in order to make this happen, you need to create these variables, and that's why you have this variable group with the name of the microservice. So for the cart API deployment, the value of app name is supposed to be cart API. That's exactly what we're doing here. For the cart API deployment, the value of service type should be cluster IP. Okay, so you need to create these variables in the cart API deploy, and then a new a variable group called product API deploy and put the same variables but with slightly different values, and again a new one for the front end deploy. Yeah, so I will present them all before running all 3 microservices in a future video, before tying everything together, but right now this is enough for you to get started with creating the variable groups. Let's run the pipeline. So if you go to pipelines and all, and we expand the deploy folder, here we have it, no runs. So we just try to run this pipeline. It will show us an error message, which is pretty simple to solve. I could not find a valid pipeline YAML file in this branch, and it's obvious because we've not added the deploy YAML to the master branch. We actually added the YAML to the deploy pipe branch. So we will select this and bam, no more error message. Okay, and if we hit run, it will start the job for us, but only after we need to give it permission. Okay, so this pipeline is using a different repository called tools, and it needs permission to do so. So you have to allow this the first time you run the pipeline ever, and then it will remember the permission and it will do it automatically. But the first time on run number 1, you need to do it. Okay, and once this is done, the job will get queued. It will wait for an agent, and then it will proceed on working. Okay, so this will fail because my Kubernetes cluster is now deleted. I don't want it to consume resources, so the deploy to AKS step should fail, and yeah, it sure did. Yeah, it became red, as you can see here. But again, reading the environment variables. So let's look, for example, app name. Yeah, cart API. So the variable group for cart API is ingested successfully. That's fine. Then if we look at the logs for the prepare deployment step, you can see here that this is the PowerShell script talking to us. So it found all the tokens in the manifest. Yeah, it's working with this manifest, as you can see here. And it found all the tokens that needed to be replaced in the manifest. And then one by one, it replaced them with their environment variable, with the corresponding environment variable. And in the end, it will actually print the manifest content to us, because that's how the pipeline is designed. Yeah, and you can see here that all of that gibberish with the pound key and all of those accolades got replaced with actual human readable stuff. Yeah, cart API, the target port, number of replicas, again cart API, the image name was composed successfully. Yeah, so all you guys need to do now, again, as let's say homework for next time to have everything up and running, is you need to create the other 2 deploy pipelines. Okay, you have cart API as an example. I showed you how to do it. Now just take these steps again from the beginning and add these files into the product API and the front end repos. And yeah, one last thing I want to do, let's go to pull requests, because we've actually added the file in a different branch. So we want to bring it to the main branch or the master branch. So in order to do this, we will create a pull request, basically merging the 2 branches together. And yeah, as you can see here, I'm moving the content of add deploy pipeline into master. Let's create that. And if you go to files, so it checked for merge conflicts. There's no conflict, which is great. If you go to files, you will see that the only difference between the 2 branches is that we added the pipeline deploy.yml. Yeah, so I'm satisfied with this change. I will complete this, and I also want to delete the source branch after we merge. So now I complete this. And if we go to the repo, I only have the master branch now, and it contains the pipeline -deploy file. Okay, so do your homework, create the same YAML file in the product API and the front end repos, create the Azure Pipeline object for each of them, and make sure when you run it, it goes as far as this one. Yeah, so it should reach the step of deploy AKS, And as you can see here, it says the resource group I told it to find the Kubernetes cluster in could not be found. So again, this resource group does not exist because of a cost perspective. I will create it when I will film the next episode. I think it's enough for today. Let me know down in the comments below if you want to discuss with me if you encounter issues while trying to replicate all of this functionality. Do let me know if you are looking for a different type of content, or if you want to go more in depth, or I skipped explaining something crucial and you didn't really grasp the concept. I would really appreciate a like and subscribe, because a lot of effort and a lot of work goes into these videos. So once again, thank you so much for giving me your time of the day. And obviously, before ending the video, we need to go back into our board and complete the fact that we created the pipeline. Yeah, we resolved the pipeline as well. So next video, I'll see you guys when we create the actual Kubernetes cluster for the infrastructure part, and then we will deploy everything in it and test, see if it's working. Okay, thank you so much for your time once again, and I wish you a great day. Cheers.